Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories. The handcuffs clicked shut on James Wilson's wrists at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, right there on the corner of Alderman Street and Fifth Avenue, in front of a coffee shop, a dry cleaner, a flower stand, and at least 30 people who had stopped walking to watch. He was 17 years old. He was wearing a blue-ribbed sweater his grandmother had given him for Christmas the year before she passed. He was not running. He was not shouting. He was not holding anything. He had done nothing. And the officer screaming into his face, a broad-shouldered, square-jawed man named Charles Robinson, badge number 4471, 8-year veteran of the Alderman District Police Department, was absolutely certain that none of that mattered. The city cameras above that intersection were rolling. They are always rolling. But on that Tuesday morning, for the first time in the history of Alderman Street, someone actually checked them. Before we get started, should tell me in the comments where you are watching from. James Wilson had been sitting on that corner for 43 minutes before Officer Charles Robinson's patrol vehicle rounded the bend from Holloway Avenue. He wasn't causing a scene. He wasn't begging. He wasn't blocking foot traffic or muttering at strangers or doing anything that any reasonable person would describe as a disturbance. And he was sitting on the low concrete step that jutted out from the base of the building that used to be a bank, a building that was now, ironically, a payday loan office, with a beat-up backpack between his feet and a paperback book open across his knees. The book was Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. He had found it 3 weeks earlier in a box left out on the sidewalk on Meridian Place, free to whoever wanted it. He wanted it. He'd already read it once, and he was reading it again because it was the kind of book that meant something different the second time through, and James was the kind of kid who understood that some things needed to be revisited. He was 17, but the life behind his eyes was older than that. He'd been sleeping in the overnight shelter on Cannon Street for 11 days, ever since his mother's boyfriend had thrown him out with 2 garbage bags and a bruise forming under his left eye that took 9 days to fully fade. His mother had watched from the second-floor window as he stood on the sidewalk below. She had not come down. He had not expected her to. That was the part that hurt worst, not the surprise of it, but the absence of surprise. The shelter had rules. You had to be out by 8 in the morning, and you couldn't return until 5 in the evening. That left 9 hours every day to be somewhere else, and James had learned quickly that somewhere else was a problem this city had no interest in solving for you. Parks had signs that said no loitering. Libraries had security guards who watched you from the moment you walked in. Diners let you sit if you bought something, but James had exactly $14.30 in his pocket, and he needed to make that last. He had chosen this corner because it had a step wide enough to sit on without hunching, and because the overhang from the payday loan office's sign kept the wind off him when it blew from the north, which it was doing that morning with a sharp, wet insistence. He had chosen this corner because he had sat on it before, 3 days earlier, for 2 hours without anyone bothering him. He had not accounted for Officer Charles Robinson being on a different patrol rotation that week. Charles Robinson had been a police officer for 8 years, and in those 8 years, he had accumulated the kind of record that looks fine on paper if you don't read it carefully. 42 use-of-force reports, 17 civilian complaints, 6 internal investigations, all of which had been closed without discipline. 1 letter of reprimand for conduct unbecoming that had been quietly expunged from his file 18 months later when his union rep filed the right paperwork. He was not, by any technical definition, a bad officer, and he had commendations too, 3 of them, from incidents where he'd helped people in genuine distress. He'd pulled an elderly woman out of a flooding car on Route 9 during the storms 2 winters back. He'd talked a man off a bridge on the Millbrook overpass. He'd located a missing child in the park off Granger Avenue who had wandered nearly a mile from her parents' picnic. These things were true. They existed. They mattered. But they did not explain, and could not excuse, what happened on the corner of Alderman and 5th on that Tuesday morning. The patrol log would later show that Officer Robinson had been dispatched to the area after a call came in at 11:31 a.m., reporting a suspicious individual near the coffee shop on Alderman. The caller had described, in the recorded transcript that would later become part of the public record, a young black male who looks like he doesn't belong here, sitting outside the lone place, staring at people. He was reading a book. The caller had not said that. The caller had looked at a 17-year-old boy sitting on a concrete step, reading Zora Neale Hurston, and decided he looked like he didn't belong, and had picked up the phone and had been connected to the non-emergency line, and had said the words, "suspicious individual," and the system had done the rest. Officer Robinson arrived 4 minutes later. Conway pulled his cruiser up to the curb across the street, sat in it for approximately 90 seconds, a detail the intersection camera would confirm, and then got out and crossed. What happened next would consume this city for the next 3 months. The cameras on the corner of Alderman and 5th were part of the city's Safe Street initiative, a $5 million infrastructure investment approved by the city council 3 years prior on the argument that more surveillance meant safer neighborhoods. The cameras ran continuously. The footage was stored on a rolling 30-day archive on the city's data servers. Most of it was never watched by anyone. The footage from that Tuesday morning showed everything. It showed James Wilson sitting on the step, his book open, his posture relaxed, his head bent slightly forward in the particular angle of someone genuinely reading. It showed a woman with a stroller pass him, glance at him, continue walking. It showed a man in a delivery uniform walk past twice. It showed a group of 3 teenagers in school uniforms walk by on the other side of the street. None of them reacted to James the way that a person would react to someone behaving suspiciously. They simply walked by. At 11:35, Officer Robinson's patrol vehicle appeared at the edge of the camera frame, pulling up to the yellow curb. The vehicle sat. James kept reading. At 11:37, Robinson got out of the vehicle. He crossed the street with the particular gait of a man who has already decided what the situation is. Shoulders square, chin level, hands loose at his sides. He walked directly to James. James looked up from his book. He said something. Robinson said something. The camera had no audio, but a lip reader later retained by the family's attorney would analyze the footage and provide a transcript. James's first words, based on her reading of the video, were, "Good morning." Robinson's first words were, "I need you to stand up." James stood up. He was careful about it, deliberate, unhurried, the way a person moves when they are trying very hard not to startle someone. He kept his hands visible. He held the book down at his side. He stood. Robinson said, "What are you doing here?" James said, "Reading." Robinson said, "You live around here?" James said something that took a moment to decipher. His lips moved more carefully here, with the particular precision of someone who is scared and is trying to be understood correctly. The lip reader's transcript read, "I stay at the Cannon Street shelter. I'm not doing anything wrong." Robinson said, "I'm going to need to see some ID." James reached slowly into his backpack. Then he produced a laminated ID card, a school ID from Garfield High, where he was enrolled, where he still showed up despite everything, where his English teacher had lent him 3 books over the course of the semester because she could see that he needed them. He held the ID out. Robinson took it. He looked at it for a long moment. Then Robinson said, "Empty your bag." James paused. Not in a suspicious way, in the way a person pauses when they have heard something that confuses them, when they are trying to determine if they heard correctly. He said something. The lip reader transcribed it as, "Why?" Robinson stepped forward. He was a bigger man, taller by 4 inches, heavier by at least 60 pounds. He stepped into the space between himself and James in a way that anyone watching would understand as a claim. This is my space now. I am deciding what happens in it. Robinson said, "Don't give me a hard time. Empty your bag." James set the bag on the step. He unzipped it. He took out the contents one by one and laid them on the concrete, and the footage showed clearly what was in that bag. 2 more paperback books, a water bottle, a phone charger, a small zippered pouch that contained a comb, a travel-sized deodorant, and a hotel sewing kit, a pair of clean socks, a folder with papers in it. Those papers, it would later emerge, were his junior year class schedule, a permission slip for a field trip he had not been able to pay for, and 4 assignments he had completed and was planning to turn in that day. There was nothing else. There was nothing dangerous. There was nothing illegal. There was the life of a 17-year-old boy who was doing his absolute best with the things he had been given, laid out piece by piece on a concrete step while a police officer watched. Robinson looked at the bag's contents for 9 seconds. Then he said something. Then James said something. Then Robinson grabbed him by the arm. James pulled back. Not violently. The footage was unambiguous on this point. He took 1 step backward, instinctively, the way a person steps back when another person suddenly grabs them. It was reflex. It was the same thing any of the 30 people now watching from the sidewalk would have done if a stranger had seized their arm without warning. But James was not a stranger, legally speaking. James was, in Officer Robinson's jurisdiction, a young black male who had failed to immediately comply. And that was all the vocabulary Robinson needed for what came next. He spun James around. He forced his arms behind his back. He applied the handcuffs with a force that James would later describe as, like my shoulders were going to come out of their sockets. He pressed James against the wall of the payday loan office hard enough that James's forehead made contact with the brick. And he shouted, loud enough that the bystanders on both sides of the street could hear, loud enough that a woman with a coffee cup stopped walking and pressed her hand over her mouth in the footage. Stop resisting. Stop resisting right now. James was not resisting. He was pressed against a wall with his hands cuffed behind his back and his cheek against brick, and he was saying, in a voice cracked with the effort of keeping it together, I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything. The camera rolled. The city servers recorded, and 30 people on Alderman Street stood on the sidewalk and watched a boy get arrested for reading a book. James was transported to the Alderman District Precinct in the back of Robinson's cruiser. He was processed. His fingerprints were taken. He was placed in a holding cell. The charge written on his intake form read, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, failure to comply with a lawful order. He was 17 years old, and he had no prior arrests. He had no prior contact with law enforcement of any kind. The school ID in his confiscated bag showed a photo of a kid who looked younger than his age, with serious eyes and a small gap between his front teeth that showed when he smiled, which wasn't often enough. He was allowed 1 phone call. He called the shelter. The woman who ran the overnight intake desk, a 53-year-old former social worker named Brenda Okafor, answered. He told her where he was. His voice broke twice while telling her. Brenda Okafor hung up the phone, called the shelter's director, and then, because she knew how these things worked, because she had watched them work for 20 years, she called a legal aid organization she had in her contacts under the name Emergency Juvenile. The attorney who picked up was a 31-year-old woman named Camille Adeyemi, who had graduated top of her class from Fordham Law, had turned down a 6-figure corporate offer to work legal aid, and had spent the last 4 years fighting exactly these kinds of cases. She wrote down James Wilson's name and the precinct address and said she would be there within the hour. She arrived in 45 minutes. In the meantime, a man named Dennis Park had been standing on the corner of Alderman and 5th when the arrest happened. He was 38 years old, a freelance journalist who wrote for a regional civic news site called the Alderman Dispatch. He had filmed the arrest on his phone from the moment Robinson grabbed James's arm. He had 12 seconds of shaky, close enough footage that showed the handcuffing, showed James's face against the brick, showed Robinson shouting, "Stop resisting," at a kid who was clearly, obviously, visibly not resisting. He filed the story at 2:15 that afternoon. He attached the footage, and the piece was titled, "Teen Arrested on Alderman Street. What Did He Do?" By 6 p.m., it had been shared 11,000 times. The Alderman Dispatch was not a large publication. Its regular readership was a few thousand people. Local residents, neighborhood watch groups, city hall junkies, school board meeting regulars. The kind of people who cared about zoning meetings and pothole complaints, and which council member had taken which donation from which real estate developer. But Dennis Park's article moved differently. It was shared first by a teacher at Garfield High, not James's English teacher, though she would also share it later, with a comment that simply said, "This is my student," but by a history teacher named Marcus Webb, who had heard through the faculty rumor network that one of the juniors had been arrested while sitting on a corner reading. He shared it at 2:48 p.m., with the caption, "This is what we mean when we talk about it." From there, it went to a community organizer named Sasha Okonkwo, who ran a local advocacy group called Alderman United, and who had 17,000 followers on social media. She shared it at 3:15. She added, "His name is James Wilson. He was reading a book. He is 17 years old. He's in a holding cell right now. Share this everywhere." The number on the share counter climbed like a thermometer in summer. By 7 p.m., local television had picked up the story. A reporter named Letitia Drummond from Channel 7 was live outside the Alderman District Precinct, her breath fogging in the November air, describing what the footage showed. The clip of Robinson shouting, "Stop resisting," while James was pressed motionless against the wall, played on a loop in the upper corner of the broadcast. By 9 p.m., the precinct's public affairs line had received more calls than it had fielded in the previous 3 months combined. A spokesperson released a statement that read, in its entirety, "The Alderman District Police Department is committed to fair and equitable policing. The incident in question is under review by the department's Office of Professional Responsibility. We are unable to comment further on an active personnel matter." This statement satisfied no one. By 10 p.m., people had begun gathering outside the precinct. Not a mob, a crowd. 50 people, then 80, then 120. They standing on the sidewalk with signs that had been made quickly, on printer paper and cardboard, with markers and spray paint and whatever was available. "Free James Wilson. Reading while black is not a crime." Where are the cameras? They didn't know yet that the cameras had everything. That part was still coming. Camille Adeyemi sat across from James Wilson in a small conference room at the Alderman precinct and listened to him tell her what happened. She did not interrupt. She had a legal pad and a pen in front of her, but she did not use them yet. She had learned in 4 years of this work that the first thing a person needs when they have been through something like this is to be heard by someone who believes them. James told her about the book. He told her about the concrete step and the wind from the north and the 43 minutes of uneventful reading. He told her about Robinson appearing, about being asked to stand, about the ID, about emptying the bag. He told her about the moment Robinson grabbed his arm and how he had stepped back without thinking, the way a body does when it is startled. "I didn't fight," he said. "I didn't run. I didn't say anything bad to him. I just stepped back and then he stopped. He looked at the table. He was quiet for a moment. He was so loud," he said finally. "He was shouting like I was doing something terrible, like I was dangerous. And I just kept thinking, does he actually see me? Or does he see who I am? Camille Adeyemi wrote that down. Not because she needed it for the legal case, but because she did not want to forget it. She secured James's release on his own recognizance by 9:30 that evening, having successfully argued to the night duty magistrate that the charges were not supported by the facts as described, that her client had no prior record, that he was a minor enrolled in school, and that the arresting officer's own incident report, which she had obtained and read on her tablet in the holding area parking lot, described a sequence of events that did not legally constitute resisting arrest under the applicable statute. The magistrate, a careful woman named Judge Elaine Forsyth, who had been on the bench for 19 years, read the report, looked at Camille over her reading glasses, and said, "These charges as written are going to have a very hard time surviving an evidentiary hearing, counselor. I'm going to release this young man." James walked out of the Alderman District Precinct at 9:44 p.m. into a crowd that had now grown to 200 people. He was not prepared for the crowd. He stopped on the precinct steps and blinked at them, and someone near the front recognized him from the photo that had been circulating and said his name. "James? James Wilson?" And the crowd heard it and responded with something that wasn't quite cheering, but wasn't quite silence either. It was the collective sound of people who had been holding their breath. Camille Adeyemi put her hand briefly on his shoulder. "You don't have to say anything," she said quietly. He nodded. He walked to Brenda Okafor's car, which was parked at the curb. Brenda had brought him a sandwich from the diner on Cannon Street. He ate it in the back seat and said very little and looked out the window at the city going by. 3 days after the arrest, Camille Adeyemi filed a formal public records request with the city's Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, which managed the Safe Street camera system. She requested all footage from the intersection of Alderman Street and Fifth Avenue for the period between 11 a.m. and 12:30 p.m. on the day of James Wilson's arrest. The request was routine, technically. Public records requests for camera footage were filed regularly by attorneys, journalists, and citizens. Most of them took weeks or months to fulfill. Most of them were opposed by city attorneys, citing privacy concerns, ongoing investigations, or some other category of bureaucratic friction. This request moved faster. The reason it moved faster was that Sasha Okonkwo at Alderman United had posted about the records request on social media the day it was filed, now framing it as a test. The cameras saw what happened. The question is whether this city is going to let anyone see what the cameras saw. The post was shared 40,000 times in 24 hours. The city's response time dropped from its usual 3 to 6 weeks to 8 days. The footage arrived on a thumb drive delivered by courier to Camille Adeyemi's office at 2:17 on a Friday afternoon. She plugged it in, opened the files, and watched the entire 11-minute sequence from Officer Robinson's arrival to the moment the police cruiser pulled away from the curb with James in the back seat. She watched it once without stopping. Then she sat still for a moment. Then she called a technician she worked with, named Gerald Fox, who was former law enforcement and now consulted on use of force cases, and she said, "I need you to come in this afternoon." Gerald Fox watched the footage twice. Then he turned around in his chair and said, "There is nothing on this tape that supports a single one of those charges. There is no resisting. There is no disorderly conduct. There is no failure to comply that I can see. That kid did everything right." Camille said, "That's what I thought." She then called a media attorney she knew, not to handle anything yet, just to run through what she was about to do, and was told that the footage, as evidence in an ongoing criminal matter, could be shared with the press in conjunction with a legal filing. She would file a motion to dismiss the charges. She would attach the footage as Exhibit 1. She drafted the motion over the weekend. She filed it on Monday morning. The motion to dismiss was 41 pages. In clear, unsparing language, it laid out a case-by-case rebuttal of every charge on James Wilson's intake form. Disorderly conduct. The footage showed a young man sitting quietly on a public step, reading, disturbing no one, posing no threat to any person or property, doing nothing that met the legal definition of disorderly conduct under city or state statute. Resisting arrest. The footage showed a single involuntary step backward in response to being unexpectedly grabbed. State case law was clear on the distinction between involuntary physical reaction and willful resistance. Camille cited 9 relevant decisions. She was thorough to the point of exhaustion for failure to comply with a lawful order. The motion raised a fundamental question that the department's own incident report had not answered. What was the lawful order? On what legal basis was Officer Robinson entitled to demand that a seated teenager reading a book empty his backpack in public? There was no arrest warrant. There was no search warrant. There had been no observed criminal conduct. For the suspicious individual call that had dispatched Robinson to the area described no specific behavior that would constitute probable cause for a search. The order to empty the bag had been unlawful. If the order was unlawful, compliance with it was not legally required. The motion also included, as a separate section, an analysis of the 911 call that had initiated the whole chain of events. Camille had obtained that recording as well. The call transcript, the caller's voice, the words used, so that the particular combination of suspicious, doesn't belong, and young black male was reproduced in the filing verbatim. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. The transcript spoke entirely for itself. The filing was submitted to the court at 9:02 a.m. By noon, it had been leaked to the Alderman Dispatch. Dennis Park, who had filmed the original arrest, published a piece that linked the full filing and embedded the intersection camera footage, which was now public record by virtue of its inclusion in a court filing, directly in the article. By 3 p.m., that article had been shared more than any piece the Dispatch had ever published. By 5 p.m., the footage had been picked up by 3 national news outlets. By 7 p.m., it was being discussed on cable news. By 9 p.m., it had been viewed, on the Dispatch's site alone, before accounting for every platform that had embedded or reshared it, more than 2 million times. 2 million people watched a police officer force a teenager who was reading a book against a wall and scream, "Stop resisting," while the teenager held very, very still. The Alderman District Police Department's response came in stages, each one revealing a little more of how institutions behave when they are caught doing what they have always done, and the world is watching. But stage 1 was denial. Not explicit denial. Nobody actually said the footage showed something different from what it showed, but a form of contextual denial, a suggestion that there were additional facts not visible in the camera footage that informed Officer Robinson's decision-making, for that the situation on the ground had involved factors that cannot always be captured in video. The department's spokesperson said these things at a press conference while the footage played on the monitor behind him and the assembled press corps sat very still in their chairs. Stage 2 was the announcement of an independent investigation by the Office of Professional Responsibility, the same office that had closed Robinson's 6 previous internal investigations without discipline. This announcement satisfied approximately no one. Stage 3 came 4 days after the filing went public, when the city's mayor, a man named David Hargrove, who had won election on a public safety platform and had, to this point, said nothing about the James Wilson case, Knight appeared in front of cameras to read a prepared statement that called the footage disturbing, called for a thorough and impartial review, and said that all residents of this city deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. He did not mention James Wilson by name. He did not mention Officer Robinson by name. He did not mention the word homeless. He did not mention that this was the 43rd use of force complaint against Alderman district officers in 18 months, nor that 17 of those complaints had been filed by black residents under the age of 25. or that none of the previous 42 had resulted in any officer facing any consequence that affected their employment. He said, "Disturbing and thorough, and dignity and respect," and left the podium quickly. Camille Adeyemi watched the press conference on her laptop in her office with a cup of coffee she had stopped drinking. When it ended, she sat for a moment, and then opened her laptop and began drafting the civil suit. On the Thursday of the week his motion to dismiss was filed, James Wilson went to school. He had considered not going. He had thought about what it would be like to walk into Garfield High with his face on the news, with his name attached to a story that everyone had seen. He had thought about what kids would say and what teachers would say, and whether he could sit in a classroom and focus on anything when the events of the previous 2 weeks kept replaying in his mind with an insistence that made it hard to sleep. He went anyway. He went because he had 4 assignments to turn in, and he was not going to let his grades slip over this. He was not going to let Charles Robinson cost him that, too. His English teacher, Ms. Patricia Rollins, was standing in the hallway outside her classroom when he arrived. She was a small woman with short natural hair and reading glasses that she wore on a chain around her neck. She had taught at Garfield for 16 years. She had seen a lot. She did not make a scene. She did not call attention to him in front of the other students. She simply looked at him when he walked up and said quietly, "I'm glad you're here," he said. "I brought my assignments." She said, "I know you did." He went to every class that day. In third period history, for with Marcus Webb, the teacher who had first shared Dennis Park's article, the class was ostensibly studying the civil rights movement, and Webb had the footage from the corner of Alderman and Fifth on a laptop on his desk. He had asked James beforehand if he was comfortable with it. James had thought about it and said yes. Webb showed the class the footage without comment. When it ended, he said, "History does not stay in the past. It moves. Or what do you want to say about what you just saw?" A girl in the second row named Amara Diallo, who was 16 and brilliant, and had never been afraid to say the thing that was true, raised her hand and said, "He was reading a book, the same kind of books we read in this class, and someone called the police because he was reading a book while being black." The class was quiet. Then someone else raised their hand, and then someone else. And the conversation that followed was one that Marcus Webb would describe, years later, when he wrote about that year for an educational journal, as the most important classroom discussion he had ever led. James sat in the back of that classroom and listened to his classmates talk about his arrest with a clarity and a fury and a grief that he had not been able to access yet himself because he was still too close to it, still too inside it. He listened to them, and something in his chest loosened, very slightly. Not everything, not all the way, but slightly. The identity of the person who had called 911 on James Wilson became a subject of significant public interest in the weeks following the footage's release. The city initially declined to identify the caller, citing privacy. Legal advocates argued that the call record was a public document. The question ricocheted through community meetings and social media threads and local news coverage. Then the caller identified themselves, not entirely voluntarily. A woman named Patricia Connolly, 44, who ran a marketing consultancy and lived in the apartment building on the north side of Alderman Street, had told several friends and acquaintances that she had been the one who called. She had done this in private conversations, and apparently not anticipating that one of those acquaintances would share what she had said with someone else, who shared it with someone else, until the information arrived in the inbox of Dennis Park at the Alderman Dispatch. Park spent a week confirming it through independent sources before publishing anything. When he did publish, he described the call and the caller's identity without editorializing. He noted that Patricia Connolly had not responded to his requests for comment. He noted that she had called a 17-year-old boy sitting on a public step, reading a book, suspicious, and someone who doesn't belong. The public response to this article was enormous and deeply unpleasant for Patricia Connolly. She received messages that ranged from pointed criticism to harassment that crossed clear legal lines. Her business received one-star reviews from people who had never used her services. Her name appeared on social media in the way that names appear when the internet decides to hold someone accountable, which is to say, everywhere, all at once, in ways that are not always proportionate or just. Camille Adeyemi made a public statement that specifically asked people not to harass Patricia Connolly. Accountability, she said, is not harassment. James Wilson's cause is not served by anyone becoming a victim in this story. What serves James is that the legal process runs its course, and that the systems that failed him are examined and changed. Patricia Connolly released a statement 2 weeks after the story broke, through a public relations firm. It said that she had made the call because she was concerned about public safety in her neighborhood, that she had not intended for anyone to be harmed, that she was sorry for any distress her call had caused, and that she hoped the community could move forward. She did not mention James Wilson's name, and she did not say she had been wrong. She said she had not intended for anyone to be harmed, which is a very specific and carefully chosen thing to say when you are trying to express something that resembles an apology without actually being one. James Wilson read the statement on his phone in the shelter common room. He read it twice. Then he set his phone down and picked up his book. He was reading The Invisible Man now. He had found it in the shelter's small bookshelf, untucked between a Reader's Digest and a paperback romance with a broken spine. He had taken it to his bunk and started it that night, and had been unable to stop. The motion to dismiss was heard 31 days after the arrest. The courtroom was not large enough for everyone who wanted to be there. People stood in the hallway. A contingent from Alderman United held signs outside on the courthouse steps. Brenda Okafor sat in the third row in her good coat, the one she wore to important things, and held her purse in her lap and watched everything very carefully. The prosecuting attorney's name was Vincent Malone. He was a capable and experienced prosecutor who, by most accounts, knew a losing case when he was sitting across from one. He had reviewed the footage. He had read Camille's 41-page motion. He had, sources would later confirm, gone to his supervisor 2 weeks earlier and said that he believed the charges could not be sustained. His supervisor had told him to proceed anyway. Vincent Malone stood before Judge Elaine Forsyth, the same judge who had released James on his own recognizance the night of the arrest, and made the best argument he could make, which was not a very good argument, because the footage said what it said, and the motion said what it said, and 41 pages of careful legal analysis is difficult to refute when the evidence supports every word of it. Judge Forsyth watched the footage in full. She had reviewed it before the hearing, but she watched it again in the courtroom, projected on the screen that was usually used to display exhibits and evidence. The courtroom was entirely silent during the 11 minutes of footage. 11 minutes is a long time to be silent in a crowded room. Every second of it registered on every person there. When the footage ended, Judge Forsyth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Malone, I have read the defendant's motion carefully, and I have reviewed the footage submitted as Exhibit 1. I have reviewed the responding officer's incident report. I am going to ask you directly. On what basis is the charge of resisting arrest sustained by the evidence in this case?" Vincent Malone answered. Judge Forsyth asked 2 follow-up questions. Malone answered those too. Then Judge Forsyth said, "And the disorderly conduct charge. Can you identify for me the specific conduct visible in the footage that constitutes disorder, and cite the applicable statute?" He cited the statute. He described the conduct. Judge Forsyth looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Camille Adeyemi. Then she looked back at the screen, which now showed a still frame. James Wilson standing on the step with his book before Robinson crossed the street. Just a kid, just a corner. Just a book. She looked at that for 3 seconds. Then she made her ruling. All charges against James Wilson were dismissed. The dismissal was with prejudice, meaning they could not be refiled. The arrest record would be expunged under the state's juvenile record statute, which Camille had already filed the paperwork to invoke. Judge Forsyth said, in the portion of her ruling that would be quoted in every piece of news coverage that followed, "The footage in this case is unambiguous. The record before me does not support the charges as written. This young man should not have been arrested. That is the finding of this court. The matter is dismissed." The courtroom was quiet for 1 full second. Then it was not quiet at all. This is the part of the story that is more complicated, because institutions are complicated, and accountability within institutions is complicated, and the machinery of consequence moves at a speed and in a direction that does not always match what justice looks like from the outside. Officer Charles Robinson was placed on administrative leave, with pay, the day after the footage went public. This was described by the department as standard procedure during an ongoing review. The Alderman District Police Officers Union issued a statement expressing full support for Robinson and confidence in the review process. The Office of Professional Responsibility investigation took 11 weeks. At the end of those 11 weeks, the OPR submitted its findings to the chief of the Alderman District Department, under a man named Chief Gordon Ellis, who had been in the role for 3 years, and who had not, during those 3 years, publicly disciplined a single officer for use of force complaints. The OPR findings were never released publicly. The city's legal team argued successfully that they were internal personnel documents, not subject to public records disclosure. What was known leaked eventually to Dennis Park, or through a source he has never identified and will not identify, was that the OPR had found that Robinson's arrest of James Wilson had been procedurally deficient, and that his use of force had been disproportionate to the level of resistance encountered. Disproportionate to the level of resistance encountered was bureaucratic language for, he used too much force on a kid who wasn't resisting. Robinson received a 30-day unpaid suspension. He was required to complete an 8-hour community policing and de-escalation training course. He was placed on a 1-year supervisory watch period. He was not fired. He was not criminally charged. The district attorney's office reviewed the footage and the OPR findings and determined that Robinson's conduct, while troubling, did not rise to the level of criminal misconduct under the applicable statutes. He was not fired. After his suspension ended, he returned to duty, but he was reassigned from the Alderman District to the Millbrook District, which was 12 miles away. This was described by the department as a routine administrative transfer. He was not fired. Camille Adeyemi had expected this. She had told James what to expect. She had been clear with him, and with Brenda Okafor, and with Sasha Okonkwo at Alderman United, that the criminal case had always been the easier battle, and that the harder one was the civil suit and the systemic fight, and that those things moved on different timelines. The civil suit, James Wilson versus Officer Charles Robinson individually, and the Alderman District Police Department as an institution, was filed 60 days after the criminal charges were dismissed. It alleged violation of James's Fourth Amendment rights through unlawful search and seizure, violation of his 14th Amendment right to equal protection, and excessive force. It named Robinson and the department, and sought damages and, so more importantly in Camille's strategic calculation, it sought injunctive relief, a court order requiring the department to change specific policies and practices. That case was still moving through the courts when James Wilson turned 18. In the months following the arrest and the footage's release, a number of things happened that were directly attributable to what had occurred on the corner of Alderman and Fifth. The city council, under sustained pressure from Alderman United and allied organizations, passed an ordinance requiring that all city camera footage relevant to civilian complaints against police officers be preserved for a minimum of 2 years and be made available in a streamlined process that did not require a full public records request. The ordinance also created an independent citizen oversight board with subpoena power, something advocates had been trying to get passed for 6 years. The Garfield High School District, responding to both the direct circumstances of James Wilson's situation and the broader conversation his case had sparked, partnered with 3 local legal aid organizations to establish an in-school legal resource program that gave students access to attorneys who could advise them on their rights in encounters with law enforcement. Marcus Webb taught a new unit on stop and frisk law and civil rights legal procedure. Patricia Rollins' English class read, "Their eyes were watching God that spring," and she told them why she had chosen it. The Cannon Street shelter received an anonymous donation of $40,000 in the 3 months following the story's peak coverage. Brenda Okafor used it to extend shelter hours by 2 hours in the morning, so that residents had less time to spend in the nowhere between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. that the city had never solved. Dennis Park, who had filmed the original arrest and published the original story, was nominated for a Regional Journalism Award. He did not win, but he was nominated. He kept reporting. He is still reporting. Officer Charles Robinson, after his transfer to the Millbrook District, received 2 civilian complaints in his first 8 months at the new posting. Both were investigated by the OPR. Both were closed without discipline. On the February morning when James Wilson turned 18, and he was sitting at a table in the Garfield High Library, working on a college application essay. He was no longer at the Cannon Street shelter. He had been there for 4 months total, had left when a housing assistance program, one that Camille Adeyemi had connected him to through a network of non-profits that worked alongside her legal aid organization, helped him secure a room in a shared apartment on the east side of the city. The room was small, and the apartment was shared with 3 adults he didn't know well, and the heating was inconsistent, but it was his. He had a key. He could stay past 8 a.m. He could come back before 5 p.m. He could sleep without someone in the next bunk coughing. He was still enrolled at Garfield. His grades had remained what they had always been. Solid, occasionally excellent, and occasionally uneven in the way that grades are when the person achieving them is managing a life that does not make studying easy. But he was there. He was still there. The essay prompt he was writing to asked, "Describe a challenge you have faced and what you learned from it." He had stared at that prompt for a long time. He had thought about the ways he could answer it. He could write about his mother and the night he had left with 2 garbage bags. And he could write about the shelter and the 9 hours every day of being nowhere. He could write about the corner of Alderman and 5th and the handcuffs and the brick wall and the man shouting, "Stop resisting," while the city cameras rolled. He wrote about the book. He wrote about finding "Their eyes were watching God" in a box on the sidewalk on Meridian Place, and why he had taken it, and what it meant to him to read something that made him feel recognized, not pitied, not documented, not studied, but recognized, the way great literature recognizes you when it names something that was already inside you, but that you had not had the language for yet. He wrote about sitting on that step on Alderman Street and reading about Janie Crawford and her search for a life that was fully, unapologetically hers, and how he had been sitting there thinking about what a fully, unapologetically his life might look like, and how that had been interrupted, and what the interruption had cost him, and what it had also, in ways he was still figuring out, taught him. He wrote, "The thing I learned is that you don't stop. You don't stop reading. You don't stop showing up. You don't stop trying to build the life you're trying to build, even when people look at you and see something other than who you are. Because who you are is what you carry inside you, and nobody gets to decide that for you. Not a neighbor with a phone, not an officer with a pair of handcuffs, not a system that was never designed with you in mind. You carry it, and you keep going, and eventually the cameras catch up to the truth. He reread what he had written. He changed one word. Then he submitted the application. Then he went to class. The corner of Alderman Street and Fifth Avenue looks the same as it always did. The payday loan office is still there. The coffee shop with the coffee sign is still there. The flower stand is still there. The same vendor, the same arrangement of carnations and tulips and whatever else is seasonal. The Safe Street cameras are still there too. They are still rolling all the time on their 30-day archive, recording everything and nothing, waiting for someone to look. The concrete step in front of the payday loan office is still there. Sometimes people sit on it. Young people, old people, people waiting for buses, people on their phones, and the people who are between somewhere and somewhere else and need a moment to stop. They sit on it, and nobody calls anyone. Sometimes, passing that corner on her way to a hearing, or a meeting, or a consultation, Camille Adeyemi looks at the step. She does not stop. She has too many cases, always. There is always a James Wilson somewhere in the machinery, a person whose name she does not yet know, caught in something they did not cause and cannot escape alone. But she looks, and she thinks about the boy with the book and what it cost him and what it revealed about a city and a system and the particular cruelty of being seen as a threat when all you are is a person, trying to read, trying to think, trying to inhabit a life that belongs entirely to you. She thinks about the cameras, always rolling, recording everything. The footage is there until someone looks at it. The truth is there until someone tells it. The story is there until someone decides it is worth hearing. This is why she does what she does. 3 months after he submitted his college applications, James Wilson received 11 responses. 8 were acceptances. 2 were wait lists. 1 was a rejection from a school he had applied to as a long shot, and which had remained a long shot. Of the 8 acceptances, 1 was from a university 400 miles away that had offered him a full scholarship, tuition, room, board, and a stipend, on the basis of his academic record, his application essay, and a letter of recommendation from Patricia Rollins that was, by every account of those who read it, the finest piece of advocacy she had ever written in 30 years of teaching. She had written in that letter that James Wilson was the kind of student who exists in every generation if you are paying attention. Someone who is going to matter, who is already mattering, who is carrying things that would break most people, and is carrying them with a grace that he would probably not describe as grace, because he is too close to it to see it clearly, but that everyone around him can see. She wrote that he had read Zora Neale Hurston on a concrete step in November and been arrested for it, and had come back to school the next week with his assignments. She wrote, "I have never been more certain that a student was going to do something important with their life. Oh, please give him the chance to do it." James Wilson accepted the scholarship. He would be the first in his family to attend a 4-year university. He was planning to study law. He told Camille Adeyemi this news on the phone on a Tuesday evening, standing in his small room with the inconsistent heating and the key that was entirely his. He said it the way you say something when you are afraid to fully believe it yet, when you are holding it carefully because you are not sure it is real. Camille Adeyemi said, "James, it's real." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay." Then he said, "Thank you for everything." She said, "Thank you for staying. A lot of people wouldn't have." He thought about that. He thought about all the times he had wanted to stop. Stop going to school. Stop fighting the charges. Stop engaging with the story when reporters called. Stop hoping for something he wasn't sure he was allowed to hope for. He thought about the moment he had decided to go to school that Thursday, with his 4 assignments in a folder in his backpack, because he was not going to let this cost him that. he said. "I had a good book." She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that acknowledges something too large for words by using a small sound instead. "Get some sleep," she said. "You've got a lot ahead of you." He said goodnight. He hung up. He sat on the edge of his bed in his small room, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he picked up his book